Okay, so this is the second video, folks. It's on Friedman. I'm just going to focus on the major points here, which is laid out in the PowerPoint. So I want to begin with this quote. This is Friedman. Again, he has an emphasis on the individual and family. So in what follows, I shall assume a society that takes freedom of the individual, or more realistically, the family, as its ultimate objective, and seeks to further this objective by relying primarily on voluntary exchange among individuals for what purpose? The organization of economic activity. So he takes this idea and applies it to school. What are schools? Well, for the outcome of economic activity, and they are for individuals and families, and things should not be coercive, it should be voluntary. So these are the ideas that you see. Again, right away, I'm going to go to the next slide. He talks about, well, this is his view of the government. What is the role of the government? One, to preserve the rules of the game by enforcing contracts. In other words, people that enter into contracts with one another in the free market, the government should make sure that they are enforced. Secondly, courts do so. Preventing coercion, so you should have police, I guess, or laws that prevent someone from just using power to overpower someone else. And lastly, to make sure that the markets are free. Now, besides that, he sees a role for a limited government. There's three exceptions. He says, well, what are those exceptions? One is when there's a natural monopoly, so trust-busting sort of stuff, because if you have corporations too big, then freedom is not promoted. The neighborhood effects. This is going to be his major argument for why we should have actually public funding of schools in America. Not necessarily public schools, but public funding of schools. Lastly, the government should have concerns for children and other irresponsible individuals. So individuals can't take care of themselves. Who's going to take care of them? The government must in some way. Okay, so he lays this all out in the first page. And he goes through in the next pages, and he's going to separate out something from general education from vocational and higher ed. So we're really focused on his arguments for general and maybe higher ed. Vocational ed is going to be defined as something a bit different. What is his argument for general ed? Okay, well, for primary and second. Should we? He goes through this stuff. He says ultimately, yes, we should. Why? Because it provides literacy and an acceptance of a common set of values. And he does this, and he says, well, if we don't provide for that common education, there's two things that the neighborhood affect us. It can affect us negatively. In other words, if these people don't go to school, children, they're going to grow up and do what? Well, they might be involved in crime. So that's going to impact everybody in our neighborhood. So therefore, let's sink money into them so that that doesn't happen. And in a positive way, you can make them contributing members to the marketplace. Okay. Okay. And also, if you don't, I guess you, as do others, emphasize the role that schools play in basically pacifying a populace. In other words, it helps them believe in the values of the country. Schools play a key role. Otherwise, you'd have to have a bigger military force to make sure that people didn't throw a revolution or something. So schools play a key role in socialization of that. Interesting, he contemplates imposing costs on the family. I'm not sure that poor families would be able to pay for that, but would it limit the birth of children? Interesting point he makes. Okay, then he goes on to vocational ed and professional schools, which is a private good. Because of that, he doesn't believe that there should be public funding of that. There's no neighborhood effect. The same. Whereas leadership education or higher ed, especially liberal education, even though it may be a private good for individuals beyond just secondary ed, it's a public good because we need to have good leaders. So he believes that we should fund some of that. And public higher ed, he's critical of, that he believes that they have a monopoly over private higher ed, and he believes that we should also compensate somehow, perhaps through the voucher system. Okay, the key for him in his argument is on page 4, where he argues that though the government should tax for schools, okay, so he justifies that finally through the neighborhood effect, he doesn't believe that they should necessarily run or administer the schools. So you might ask, well, okay, how did public schools, all of them are sort of government-run schools. How did that happen? He does sort of make a point. Well, maybe we should publicly tax for it, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the government needs to run it. So this is sort of the push for privatization. In other words, it doesn't mean that you don't publicly tax, but you might have private individuals or private groups running those schools. So he forwards the idea of a voucher here, similar to World War II. Vets, when they came back, they got a voucher that they could then choose to go to any university that they wanted, private or public. He says, why don't we use the same idea and we'll provide vouchers for families, and that way they can choose private or public school, but in doing so, you'll enter competition, the values of competition into the and the ideas of the marketplace, and offer real choice to parents, and with the assumption that they will choose quality over just the neighborhood school, which doesn't allow choice. So if they choose private or even a parochial or school over a public school, then that would be legitimate in his regards. This, by the way, has been upheld in the Cleveland case. I think it was 2001, because it was a separation of church and state still, even though many of them in Cleveland were parochial schools. The argument was that you didn't fund the schools, but you funded the family. Okay, so the role of government is still important. He says it should ensure that it meets minimum standards, so a regulatory agency, essentially, to make sure that public schools, or schools that are getting public money, meet expectations. And his argument, of course, are private schools at a real disadvantage, because the government schools have a monopoly over all of the taxpayer money. Okay, if you want to take a look at the next slides, without competition, public schools are not forced to improve. You take these ideas. Teachers' salaries shouldn't be determined by unions, but by the free market. So merit-based pay sort of ideas. And if government schools if they don't attract students because they're through the use of vouchers, because they aren't quality, then they would close. Okay, so what would happen to that building? Well, it's the public's building, so the public, why don't they sell it off, use that money, or rent it out to a new school, like a voucher school, a private or a charter school that will emerge. And if they can provide a better quality education, they'll attract the students. So each family will get a certain voucher, and schools will compete with each other for those students and the money that's with them. Now, we still have that today. We don't have vouchers, but within the system as it is, charter schools are competing against public schools for students, especially public schools in rough areas. Okay, so you might think about the system as is. Okay, who wins and who loses? Well, the biggest beneficiary in the current system are suburban parents who send their kids to public schools, because they essentially have, a private education. Okay, especially think of New Trier, places like that. Not everybody can get that education because you have to live there to get that education. So it's called public, but it's not the same public education as is offered by Sullivan, for instance, in the city. It's very, very different, but they're both public. So, argument often is made is that this is really a private education that they get, and they're just winning in the system as is. Now, who loses? People would say, well, who loses most are parents of public school kids in failing public schools. Also, they would say, who pays the most? Well, those suburban parents who send their kids to private schools because they're paying twice. Again, freedom here is associated with choice, diversity with choices. The last part, it gets into higher ed and then vocational ed. I'm not as interested in covering at this point. I'm going to run out of time as well. You can take a look at that, but you see these ideas also impacting on his ideas on that. So, okay, have a great week. We'll see you guys next week. Hope you enjoy the readings.